I have to apologise actually. I'm a bit tired today because I had a knock on the door late last night, and it was the police. And Mrs. B went downstairs, and she answered the door, and the police said, "Gosh, I'm terribly sorry. We've got some bad news about your husband." And I was just behind her actually, but I didn't go all the way downstairs because I was still in my pyjamas. And they said, "It looks like he's been hit by a bus." And she said straight away, deadpan, "I know, but he's got a lovely personality." That was her comment. So there you go. All right, look, it's 5 past, so it's time. So we've got a question from Emily, which is wonderful. So if you look at 12:02, fabulous timing, Emily. You say, "Emily, I was a bit confused as to what the difference was between a not justified inferentially principle and a moral intuition." So Emily, that's an excellent question, and I must add something about that to the notes. So here's the problem. The term intuition gets used in a whole variety of different ways on this course. So if you remember right back, Emily, to the beginning of the course, we used the term intuition, moral intuition, for a judgment that was spontaneous and unreflective. That was following Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues. Now the problem with that is that's something quite different from what philosophers often mean by an intuition. So for example, Audi, speaking very roughly, Audi thinks that an intuition is something that gives rise or can give rise to a, what does he call it? A self-justified, a self-evident belief. That's to say, a belief that just in virtue of understanding the proposition believed, you're justified in believing. And so there's a variety of things we might mean by intuition. And indeed, just as you're suggesting, one thing that we could mean by intuition, and I think this is true in lots of philosophy, is a premise that we take, although it's not justified inferentially. So it's something that we just have a high subjective degree of confidence about. It seems like it's likely to be true to us. Now, so I wanted to avoid the use of the term intuition in this context, and so I said what I'm focusing on here is that the fact that the thing is not justified inferentially. And that was just in order to separate it out from other uses of the term intuition, because it was very important in the argument that we're working on that we're not talking about judgments which are unreflective or spontaneous. So the targets that we're attacking when we're thinking about Green's argument against the ethicists, that's an argument which is really against people who are highly reflective, taking a long time and thinking very carefully before arriving at a judgment. So Emily, that's just the first part of your question, but am I making sense so far?
Yes, so you're not even considering more intuition in the sense of Aldi neither?
Sorry, in the sense of?
Sense of Aldi, the philosopher.
No, I mean, actually, so I am interested in that. And what you'll notice is this. So if I talk about a not justified inferentially premise, that is not necessarily a self-evident proposition, but it could be. So Audi's category of self-evident propositions is actually narrower than not justified inferentially premises. But the idea of a self-evident premise is that if you understand it and believe it because you understand it, you're thereby justified in accepting it. But that's a non-inferential form of justification. So that would count as a non-justified inferentially premise. Now the thought is this. Green's argument shows that in general, with some limits that I'm not going to mention for a second, we shouldn't rely on not justified inferentially premises. And so that would apply in particular to the kind of self-evident beliefs that Audi proposes. The catch there, of course, the reason why that applies is because if we accept Green's argument, then there aren't any self-evident propositions. That's just a mistake. That's the view I'm offering. Does that make sense so far, Emily?
Is there so the intuition Audi is talking about is a subset of the non-justified inferentially principles?
Exactly, that's right.
And is there anything in between that is not in the subset?
Yes, indeed. So suppose, now this is going to be a tiny bit controversial, but suppose you're looking at me and you think to yourself, Steve has lost his sense of taste. Right? It's not COVID, I always dress like this. So you think to yourself, Steve has lost his sense of taste. That would be a not justified inferentially belief that you have because it's on the basis of perception. Now, of course, some people do think that perceptual beliefs are inferentially justified, but I think it's fair to say there's quite a major range of philosophers who think that when you believe something because you see it or you believe something because you hear it, So the belief that Steve is speaking on the basis of the hearing, that's a belief that you have which is not justified inferentially. So if you took that as a premise in an argument, that again would be a premise that wasn't justified inferentially. So I think that perceptual beliefs are a good candidate for not justified inferentially, although they're not, I think, the self-evident.
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you. But if I don't care about the perceptual NJIP, the non-justified inferentially principles, and I just want to ask if there's a difference between a moral non-justified inferential principle and a moral intuition, then is there something in between?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I think there are. Well, hang on a second. I think there are cases where people just guess. So David Lewis says that intuitions are guesses. Now, I don't think that's quite right. I don't think intuitions are exactly guesses, because I think there's a specific reason why people make certain guesses and not others, and that's to do with their psychological processes. But if we think of guesses, they're also premises which are not justified inferentially. So if I make a guess and then take that premise, there's no inferential justification there, but it wouldn't count as an intuition in Audi's sense. So Audi would want to say that's not an intuition, whereas Lewis would be happy with the idea that that is an intuition. But for me, they're just not justified inferentially premises, so it all falls into the same bag.
Okay, thank you a lot.
Yeah, so I'm using that. It's a very awkward term, and I see you've given me a 4-letter acronym for it, NJIP. Thank you, Emily. I see it's a very awkward term, and it's supposed to be awkward because it's trying to get you to think that it's something non-obvious, but we're focusing on the property rather than trying to sort of say something about what intuitions are. Now let me just move on through your question, Emily, because there's some very nice things here. So you say, in my understanding, if a not justified inferentially premise is justified, then it's justified non-inferentially from no other premise. Exactly so. It doesn't have to be justified, but if it is, it can't be justified inferentially. And if a non-justified inferentially premise is not justified, then it can't be justified at all. I think that's how I'm going to read that. So I'm with you there. And then you say the definition seems to hold for moral intuition as understood by Sinnott-Armstrong. Gosh, that's actually a very good point. So, sorry, Emily, I should have come there first. So Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues, as Emily, you remember this, and other people may remember this as well, they say that an intuition is a belief which is formed spontaneously and without reflection. That's their idea about moral intuition. And that would indeed, if you use those premises for not... if you use those intuitions in their sense for premises, then you would have a not justified inferentially premise. That's absolutely true. But if we focus just on those, what the philosophers will tell us is, look, we as philosophers are thinking very carefully about our premises. We're not forming these things spontaneously. So we're not really doing the same thing. In philosophy, our intuitions are not the Sinnott-Armstrong et al. Things. That's not what they're talking about. All right, good. Emily, I think you and I, we're sorted on the not justified inferentially premises and the moral intuitions. Am I right?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yes.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate that question. This is a lovely example. I'm going to have to go and update some of the notes and just add a couple of notes in about the connection there. I have to say, I find it enormously difficult. So for myself, I just don't use this intuition stuff. It's not part of how I've really been doing philosophy. I wasn't trained that way. So it's all, I find it a minefield, actually. I find it a minefield. And I think the really important thing for us is to try not to get too much into, meta-philosophy. So there's a lot of stuff about the philosophy of philosophy, and I think that's as much as possible to be avoided, because of course our concern is the moral psychology itself. So we don't want to get too away from that if we possibly can. All right, very good. So at this point, I have to tell you folks that I'm completely out of questions. So it's thanks to Emily that we've had the first question, but you're really going to have to provide some questions. Oliver.
Hi, it's PT actually here, Paul Theo. I'm just with Oliver.
Oh, hi, Paul Theo.
It's okay.
Should I call you PT? That's nice.
Small question. I know that's getting a bit into the minefield you're just talking about that you try to avoid. But what would you maybe respond to? There's Humer, for example, who talks about a revisionist intuitionism, where he agrees with Green and Singer, and he takes the objection that yes, a lot of our case intuitions likely are biased, have a strong evolutionary influence, societal and personal biases. But he then says that if we look at more abstract intuitions about more general moral principles, and we look for coherence within them, then we again can be justified in believing them because they're a coherent set of abstract principles. And for abstract principles, he claims it's quite unlikely that evolution, for example, would have any influence on that, or societal bias would influence on that. So would you say that actually same problems apply, or is that a way to get out of that potentially?
Excellent. Thank you, Paul Theo. That's a very good question. And actually, I addressed that in the lecture this week. So I forget which section. I think it was in the section on reflective equilibrium. So what you're describing is in some ways rather similar to reflective equilibrium in that it has a coherentist flavour. And in that section, I'm arguing precisely to meet the challenge that you're offering. I'm saying, I think although the original reconstruction of Green's argument was just about non-inferentially justified premises concerning specific cases, I think we can indeed generalise beyond that. And if I may, I'd just like to show you a slide. So here's the thing about the fast processes. So the fast processes are supposed to be fast, and like all broadly inferential processes, Paul Theo, that involves trading off speed against accuracy. So if you want to go faster, you've got to drop some accuracy. If you want to gain accuracy, you're going to have to slow down a bit. And that turns out to be a very general principle that's informed more than 100 years of cognitive science. And I'm quite excited about those things because you've got something simple that's really stood the test of time. I think, we should really respect that. So there's a speed accuracy trade-off. What we know is that the fast processes are trying to be reasonably accurate in typically encountered situations. That's what they really care about. And what they have to do then is to sacrifice some accuracy in order to be fast. Now, what you can imagine, so this is supposed to be a sort of metaphor for the learning environment. And often the learning environment will be, in this technical sense, wicked. That's to say that when you look at the fast process approximation, it'll be super good in typically encountered situations. So here you've got something that looks like a straight line, but it turns out that this curve is a more complicated form of parabolic curve. It's just that you don't see that in the typically encountered situations, and that allows the fast process to be extremely effective. If you wanted to model this properly, you'd need to add a lot more parameters. So this is essentially the core argument. Once you get outside of your typically encountered situations, so ones that your fast processes don't have to do, we have very good reason to think that those fast processes will be unreliable. Now, it might turn out that they're reliable, so it could turn out that what we're observing here was a straight line, but that would be a kind of coincidence. That would be a coincidence. So the important thing here is we don't know whether or not the fast processes will be accurate or not, but they're unreliable. There's no reason whatsoever to think that they would be, because it's not their job. It's just not their job to care. Now, the key thing about this argument, this is Paul Theo, this is really the answer to the question. The key thing about this style of argument that I'm just sort of sketching here, not really giving it, the key thing about this argument is that it applies just as much to general principles as to ideas about particular moral scenarios. So if you wanted to, you could think of particular moral scenarios as points on the curve, and the shape of the line itself as the principle. What we should find is that if we rely on fast processes to generalize beyond typically encountered scenarios, we should expect that we will get things wrong. There's no guarantee that we'll get them wrong, but we should expect to get them wrong. So that's my suggestion about what's wrong with this approach that you're proposing. Relying on the fast processes to move beyond the familiar situations, those that are typically encountered and form the basis for learning, is a recipe for getting things wrong. And the reason I think, although you haven't got an excellent argument here, the reason I think it's somewhat plausible is you can see exactly that happening in the history of physics. So in the history of physics, you get exactly that, people generalizing on the basis of impressions provided by fast processes and coming up with a very interesting and somewhat useful picture of the physical. but one that precisely falls apart as you move away from the typical situation. So if friction now becomes important to you, variations in friction become important to you, that isn't just wrapped up in the typical way with gravity, air resistance and the rest. If those things are not all super wrapped up in the nice way that they ordinarily are, but they come apart, your model generates massively incorrect predictions. How am I doing, Paul Theo? PT.
Well, as always, no, does make sense. Maybe quick follow-up, especially I'm just trying to fail to see what kind of errors fast processes would create in when we have intuitions about very abstract sort of principles. So, for example, I mean, it could be a logic principle like if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C, or like even more basic logic principles you can't provide any proof of, or even things like, oh, if there's more harm done, something is worse. That's something we would probably say is intuitively very appealing to us, but how could our fast process go wrong there, basically? That would be my.
So I think the analogy that we're looking for here is things like Euclidean geometry. So there's some axioms that seem very compelling intuitively. So parallel lines can never connect, can never intersect. Parallel lines can't intersect. Seems very hard to reject that, or did seem very hard to reject that for a long time. And now my sense is that we're just like, hey, you know, there are all these different geometries. They have different uses. The axiom of choice in logic, it's possible to create a set that contains one member from any collection of sets whatsoever. Seems like super plausible. How could that be wrong? But it turns out that if set theory plus the axiom of choice is consistent, then so is set theory with its negation. So that tells us, I think, that we don't have good grounds for accepting these things that seem very plausible. And in the ethics case, I think we run just the same risk. So you were just saying, look, less harm is always better than more harm. Very hard to argue with that, and as a practical matter, I won't be arguing with that, but I wouldn't trust it. I wouldn't trust that principle, because I don't think, in the absence of some interesting sort of justification for it, some way of doing ethics that provides me with the kind of justification that we have in mathematics or logic or physics or whatever your model might be, I don't think we should trust it as a general principle. It's a generalization from cases that will serve us very well in the typically encountered situations.
Perfect, that makes sense. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Now, there's a different line here. Now, you mentioned this, I think, because anybody who's got more questions, you just have more questions, because you don't really want me waffling on about this. But PT, you package that together in just the way that Rawls does, with a broad form of coherentism. So there is another way to go here, which I think is not affected by this argument. And the other way to go here is to say something like this. The best we can do is come up with a coherent system. The best we can do is come up with a coherent system. And it may be, just as in the case of thinking about set theory, for example, or geometry, there are many coherent, consistent sets of propositions that we can entertain. But it's still interesting to do this because, of course, it turns out that the range of possible theories that you might have, the range of possible set theories or the range of possible ethical theories, is actually fairly small in some ways. There are, as it turns out, subtle forms of inconsistency that we don't at first notice. So the first thing to say here is it can be incredibly valuable to work out which propositions are consistent with each other and where you get subtle forms of inconsistency or tension. So even if you don't accept the coherentist project and you don't think we should rely on the not justified inferentially premises, you might well think that we want to find out which sets of propositions are coherentist. You might also think that Aristotelian physics, although clearly we can do better now, for a long time that was the state of the art, and it actually was incredibly useful, and there are still purposes for which it's perfectly sufficient. So you might say, well, look, it's true that we know that if we base an ethical theory on not justified inferentially propositions, we're going to come up with a false theory. But that's okay, because we're human, we're fallible, we just do the best that we can, and this is the best that we can do in the situation. That approach, again, I think, isn't touched by the green objection. So the green objection there, essentially, if we're prepared to say, this is the best we can do, we know in advance that it's going to produce some falsehoods, but we also know that any theory that we as humans produce is likely to generate some incorrect predictions and eventually to be superseded by a better one if we're lucky. That's okay, right? That's okay. So really all we're getting out of that is some modesty. An alternative way to go here, of course, now here we're getting into metaethics, would be to say, look, the thing about ethics is that it's different from physics. It's not answerable to reality in the same way that physics is. That's why in the case of physics you can test your predictions, you can go and build, particle accelerators and all kinds of marvelous things. In the case of ethics, we don't have the equivalent of a particle accelerator to test what we're doing. Now, I'm not saying this is right, I'm just saying, well, there's a possibility. And in that case, what you might say is that what we should try to do is to create an ethical system that will be useful. Our ethical abilities have served us and been useful in various ways and hindered human flourishing in other ways. And what we should do is we should think about, what kind of flourishing do we want to achieve? What are our values? And then try to build an ethical system that gives us the best chance of achieving those. So PT, we're in all kinds of hot water here, but I think the thing I want to stress here is that accepting that we can't rely on not justified inferentially premises in ethical arguments, even about general principles that get us to knowledge, doesn't mean giving up on ethics at all. It just means maybe a more modest way of approaching ethics, which I think is the real attraction of these arguments, if they work. I'm still pausing for questions. Well, I've got a question. So what's coming up in the lecture next week? So next week, sadly for me, is the final lecture. So two things are coming up. One is I'm still looking for ways to try to knock down the conclusion that we can't rely on not justified inferentially premises if we want to use an argument to gain knowledge of its conclusion. So that argument to me seems like it has all of these consequences, and that's a sign that there could well be something wrong with it. So an argument that has such far-reaching consequences, there could well be something wrong with it. And I think what we really have to do at this point, so last week, this week rather, I was looking at quick objections to it, to try and find some quick way of getting around the argument. And Paul Theo, your point about maybe we can switch from thinking about particular moral scenarios to general principles, that would be a great quick way of dealing with the argument if it worked. So I don't think those work, but I think it might be that we're just wrong about the fast processes. So this is what I'm going to think about next week. One of the two things I'm going to think about next week. It might be that we're just wrong in the comparison between ethics and physics, or ethics and numerical cognition, ethics and social cognition. It might be that we're just wrong about the fast processes. Now, I don't think I'm going to be able to show that we are wrong about that, but I think it's important to investigate that and see what grounds for doubt there might be, because it seems to me that's probably the best bet here. There's essentially two strategies in response to this that I think have a chance of working. One is Railton's ideas about learning. So Railton is pushing very hard on the idea that fast processes are actually incredibly flexible learning processes. The problem there, I think, is that he is wrong, basically. So it's a very interesting line of argument, but I think he's just not taking the challenge of the trade-off between speed and accuracy seriously enough. But I might be wrong about that. So I think that's definitely, that seems like a big challenge. The other challenge is, well, maybe we can just reject the dual process theory that gives us the fast process. And again, I'm not hopeful that we can flat out reject it, but at least we could try and make trouble for it. So that's one thing that we're doing next week, Steve. The other thing that we're doing next week is something that's very close to my heart. We're going to look very briefly at the development of moral psychology in humans. So what happens in infancy and early childhood. And although we're not going to spend a long time and look at that very deeply, what I'm going to try to do is provide enough of a basis for anybody who's interested and wants to take that further, that they've got a tiny starting point. They've got some sense of what literature there is and roughly the sorts of claims that are made in the literature. So although that's only a very tiny part of the course, it might be something that appeals to one or two people who want to take it further. So yeah, that's what I've got planned for next week. But is there anything else you'd like to see next week in the lecture? Well, look, we are at the time that officially our meeting ends. this is the last of these live sessions, although informally I'm going to be here next week, just as always, and I'm going to send you a link and so on. So you're welcome if you would like to join me and to ask questions. Perhaps somebody else should take up the mantle of telling jokes. I'm out of telling jokes, but I think that's a nice thing to do. I used to tell, when I first joined Warwick, I had this brilliant thing. I was teaching first year logic, and one of the lectures was in a room shaped like a horseshoe. It was really almost like a club. It was almost like a club. And those students, I mean, we had such a good laugh doing first year logic. It was so much fun. And I've never managed to recreate that. And I feel like, in the virtual scenario, it's even harder, isn't it? But we've got to try. We've really got to try. So next week, please ask questions in advance if you'd like to. Come prepared to tell a joke in case no one has any questions. The best one we've had so far is Emily's request for set theory in lecture 9, which I think is quite funny. And otherwise, thank you very much. You're all very marvellous. It's wonderful that you're here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on Wednesday if you're in my seminar group, or otherwise, perhaps informally, if you feel like you want to come on Thursday for the final, very informal last session. Thank you very much, everybody. Take good care. See you next week.